The north is cold and full of whispers.
The dead don't sleep. They only wait. The nightmare didn't end. That was the wrong thing. Nightmares ended, you woke drenched and shaking with the ceiling above you where ceilings belonged, and the horror ebbed out like seawater pulling off a shore. Jon Snow had been having nightmares since he was 5 years old. He knew exactly how they worked. This one didn't stop. The music first. Strings. Light and sweet, and completely obscene inside that feast hall. The rains of Castamere climbing through the twins while the torches shook. He'd been in the yard when it began. He'd heard it through the canvas walls, and he hadn't understood. Hadn't understood until the screaming started, and the arrows came through, and Grey Wind, he stopped the memory. It kept moving anyway. Robb's crown. Rolling across the stones. A Frey soldier's boot coming down on it, laughing, then knives. Closer and colder, these knives he knew better because they were his knives. Meant for him. Bowen Marsh's wet eyes above the blade while other hands pinned his arms, and the cold came not all at once but in stages. Each wound, a door opened inside him, until everything that was Jon Snow began pouring through. He'd thought it was snow. It wasn't snow. That was just what dying felt like. Then the sea at Hardhome. The cliff. The Night King's arm lifting slowly, almost gentle, and 10,000 dead things climbing to their feet with the sound of one long exhale. Then Daenerys. King's Landing. The bells already ringing, the bells meaning surrender, and it hadn't mattered. Nothing had mattered. The fire came anyway. Then his own voice, barely his own, "I don't want it." Then the dark. The long kind. The permanent kind. Until now. Jon Snow opened his eyes. Stone ceiling. Tallow candle burned down to a stub on the table beside him. Slit window above showing pre-dawn. Barely started, barely trying. The smell of castle black, cold stone and rendered fat, and somewhere below, faintly, old hay and horse, real smells, the smells of a place that still existed. He lay still for a long time. His right hand found the wound in his thigh before the rest of him arrived. Not because he reached for it, because every movement his body attempted ended there, a hot dragging complaint from the arrowhead scar still knitting itself back together under the linen wrapping. Ygritte's arrow. He remembered the whistle of it, and the impact, and her face when she loosed it. His calf throbbed underneath, the second arrow, lower, placed with the specific accuracy of a woman who knew exactly how to ensure a man couldn't ride fast enough to escape if she'd wanted to stop him. She hadn't wanted to stop him. That was the thing he'd understood only afterward. In the cold of Castle Black with the wounds going septic, she'd aimed to hurt, not to kill. The distinction had mattered enormously, and he hadn't known what to do with it then and didn't know now. He remembered her face at Hardhome too, on the wrong side of the water, but that wasn't something he could carry right now. Both things were true simultaneously. The wounds 3 weeks fresh, and 30 years of life and dying lived after them. Both of them his, both of them real. He held his hands up in the candlelight and stared at them. Wrong, both of them wrong. Thinner than they should be. The calluses were a boy's calluses, built from hard training, but not yet from a decade of Valyrian steel. The burn scars weren't there. The split and resplit knuckles of a man who'd been fighting something every season of his life weren't there. The scar across his palm from Corran Halfhand's blade, gone. These were 16-year-old hands holding the memories of a man who had died at a table in Castle Black with his brother's knives in him. Jon sat up. The thigh wound tore at him. He breathed through it, one slow pull of damp stone air, until the white of the pain stepped back into something workable. He swung his legs to the floor. The boards were freezing against bare soles. Good. Cold was real. Cold was something to hold. He took inventory the way he'd learned to take inventory in a life that had punished every moment of inattention. Not emotion first. Not the grief or the rage or the vertigo of being impossibly, inexplicably here. Facts. Fact. He was alive. Specifically, he was 16 and alive in Castle Black in 299 AC, with 2 arrow wounds healing and everything that was going to happen burned into him like brands. Fact, The Red Wedding was 3 weeks away. Robb Stark was alive. Grey Wind was alive. Catelyn Tully was alive. All of them marching toward the twins, believing the war was nearly finished. Fact, inside this castle right now, there were men who would turn everything he was about to do to ash. He stopped on Thorne. Alliser Thorne was not a complicated enemy. He was a southern man who had spent his life experiencing the Wall as exile and other men's competence as personal insult. And he had spent 2 years converting that into something systematic. Green boys sent on ranging assignments designed to expose and break them. Ravens going quietly south, not to the Lannisters. Thorne wasn't a Lannister creature. He was simply a man who believed the Night's Watch existed to enforce Southern order and needed Southern friends to do it. A long, patient campaign of bleeding the watch of every brother who might have listened when Jon came back through the gate with news of what was massing beyond it. Thorne in authority while the dead gathered in the dark was not a thing Jon was willing to carry again. Ghost was in the corner. The direwolf hadn't made a sound. He never did. He sat in the shadows beneath the shelf of Maester's texts with his red eyes open, watching Jon with the quality of attention that nothing built with 4 paws and a wolf's skull should have been able to hold. Jon had sometimes thought, in the life he'd burned through and lost, that the bond between them ran through something older than words, that Ghost knew things Jon hadn't told him yet. The wolf was watching him now the way Jon had seen him watch men just before their hands moved toward their weapons. "I know," Jon said. His own voice, low and rough and real, the first words he'd spoken in a body he'd been born into, but never quite understood. "I know what we have to do." Ghost stood. Thorne wasn't asleep. That was the first thing. He was dressed when Jon and Ghost came through the door, which meant either the man never slept, or something older than thought had woken him. He stood beside his pallet with his sword belt in his hands, and his face already arranging itself into the particular contempt he wore the way other men wore linen. Snow, like something expelled. "You should be in Maester Mullen's care." "I was." Jon stepped into the room. Ghost stepped with him, and Thorne's eyes went to the wolf and stayed there. "I need you to hear me carefully, and I need you to hear me without reaching for that sword belt. Because if you reach for it, Ghost decides what happens next, and I'm not going to stop him." Thorne said nothing. His jaw worked. "I know about the ravens you sent to Sir Donal Waynwood 3 months ago." Jon kept his voice flat and precise. "I know what you promised him and what you asked for in return. I know about the exercise you ran the Molestown recruits on last autumn, the one that sent 2 of them into the gift and whether no trained ranger would have survived. And didn't. I know what you've been offering Janos Slynt in exchange for his political support at a Lord Commander election that hasn't happened yet." He watched Thorne's face go still, the way a man's face went still when he understood he was looking at something that shouldn't exist. "And I know that none of it was for the Watch. Not one piece of it. It was for you, and your comfort, and your position when this wall eventually falls, which you've spent 2 years accelerating. The only man who could know those things is a man who's already watched this play out once." Jon's voice didn't rise. "There is a wildling army marching on this wall right now. 100,000. Behind the wildlings, things you've spent your career insisting are children's stories. I've been beyond the wall. I've seen them. I've watched them raise the dead at the shore of an open sea, and I will not stand in this castle and watch you make it easier for them to reach us." He held Thorne's eyes. "You have 2 choices. You let Gren and Ed walk you to the yard cells and we handle this through the Watch's own law when there's time to handle it properly. Or you reach for that sword belt and find out exactly what I'm willing to do when I have nothing left to lose." Gren filled the doorway behind Jon, Ed beside him. Thorne looked at them, looked at Ghost, looked at Jon's face, where, he seemed to realize, there was no performance happening. No anger, no relish, no 17-year-old boy trying to prove something, just a man who had already decided. Thorne put the sword belt on the table. Slynt took less than 5 minutes. Jon didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway with Ghost at his knee and told Slynt 3 things he couldn't possibly know unless he'd been inside Slynt's private correspondence, and watched the former commander of the Gold Cloaks do what Janos Slynt always eventually did when the borrowed authority was stripped away, collapse inward, like wet timber in a fire that had finally found it. Both of them were in the yard cells before the first watch change. 6 brothers Jon trusted were standing watch by the time he crossed the yard toward the library. Above him, the sky was the color of old iron. The wall caught the earliest gray of dawn along its upper edge, hundreds of feet of it, and didn't look like ice in this light. It looked like bone. Sam was asleep over his books. He always was, at this hour, slumped with his cheek pressed against a page about the doom of Valyria, his breathing slow and even, one hand still loosely holding his quill. The candle beside him was burning its last quarter-inch. Jon stood in the doorway long enough to look at him properly. In another life he'd gone north and left Sam to manage alone and never said what he owed him. He hadn't known how. He'd been better at carrying weights than at naming them. He put a hand on Sam's shoulder. Sam jolted awake, nearly sent the candle flying, grabbed the edge of the table with both hands. Jon, you should be in bed. Maester Mullen said you weren't supposed to be walking. Your leg. There are things I need you to do, Jon said. He sat down across from him. He kept his voice low and even, and he watched Sam's face shift, the sleep confusion hardening into something alert and wary. The kind of attention Sam gave things when he understood they were serious. Before the first bell. Sam looked at him, then looked at Ghost in the doorway. Then back at Jon. What did you do? Sam said. Not a question. Thorne and Slint are in the yard cells. 6 men we trust are watching them. Jon placed both hands flat on the table. What I need to do next means I can't stay here. It means I may not come back to this place. He met Sam's eyes and held them. I need a horse. A fresh one. And ravens, 3 of them. I know where I need to go, and I know I won't be coming back. Maester Aemon's chambers were at the base of the king's tower, 3 levels below where Jon had left Sam sitting with 3 ravens and the look of a man rearranging everything he thought he understood. The corridors at this hour were empty in the specific way of places that emptied at midnight, and wouldn't fill again until the 6th bell, a stationed lamp every 20 feet, each burning low, the stones between them gone black. Jon's boots on the flagging sounded wrong to him. Too loud, too present, his own body still felt like something borrowed. He stopped at Aemon's door. Through the wood, nothing, no movement. No candlelight showing at the gap beneath. He raised his fist. Held it there a moment he couldn't account for. Knocked, a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Come in, Aemon said. The old man was sitting upright at his writing desk, with his hands folded in his lap and no candle lit. He didn't need one. He sat in the total dark the way most men sat in full firelight, settled, composed, not waiting for anything in particular. His milky eyes were open and aimed at nothing, though his head turned toward the door with an accuracy that had nothing to do with sight. Jon Snow, Aemon said. Not a question. He knew the step, probably, or the weight of the breathing. He'd had 100 years to learn what things sounded like. Jon closed the door behind him. He didn't sit. He stood in the center of the room with the dark around both of them, and the smell of old ink and cold parchment, and the dry, settled stillness of a fire, banked hours ago. Maester Aemon. He stopped. Started again. I need to tell you something that I have no way to prove to you except to say it plainly and let you decide what it means. Aemon's head tilted a degree. That is generally the only way anything true gets said. Jon breathed in once. Let it out. I know what you are, he said. What you chose not to be. I know your name, your full name, and I know why you came to this wall, and I know that you have spent 50 years watching your family destroy itself from a place where you couldn't stop any of it. He paused. I am not telling you this to demonstrate that I've read the right histories. I'm telling you because what I'm about to say requires you to understand that I already know who is in this room. The old man said nothing. His folded hands didn't move. My name is Jon Snow, Jon said. But I was born Aegon. Rhaegar Targaryen was my father. Lyanna Stark was my mother. She died in a tower in Dorne giving birth to me, and she made Ned Stark swear on the last breath she had to keep that secret until it was safe to end it. his own voice holding flat and even, not because he felt flat and even, but because it was the only instrument he had. The secret was never safe. Ned died for other reasons before he could end it. So I'm ending it now. Aemon sat without moving for a long time, the kind of stillness that wasn't absence, the kind that was everything pulled inward at once. Rhaegar, Aemon said, barely a sound. The name sitting in the air between them like something sealed in a room for years, and finally free of it. He's been dead for 16 years, Jon said, as gently as he knew how. I'm sorry. I knew he was dead. Aemon's voice came from somewhere very far down. I knew the moment the ravens stopped. When Eris burned. When Robert took the throne. There was nothing left after that could have been good news, so I stopped waiting for it. He tilted his head toward Jon. Deliberate now. Come here. Jon crossed to him. Aemon reached up with both hands. Dry hands, light as paper. They found Jon's jaw first, then moved, careful and absolutely certain, the way a man reads something written in a language he learned before he lost his sight. Across his cheekbones, the bridge of his nose, his brow, the place where his hair began at his temple. Aemon's breath changed. He had this, the old man said quietly. This shape here. His thumb traced the line of Jon's cheekbone, slow. His mother didn't have it. His father didn't. I always thought it came from further back. From Daeron, perhaps, or older still. But Rhaegar had it. His hands lowered to his lap. Say something else. Anything, I don't have time, Jon said. A thin sound came out of Aemon. It took Jon a moment to understand it was a laugh. No, Aemon said. Your voice is nothing like his. Rhaegar's voice was made for great halls and harp strings, but the way you stop between sentences, the way you choose the exact word and then go quiet and wait. His face was doing something slow and deep and not performable. That was always him. Jon didn't answer. He couldn't. He was not a natural fighter, Aemon said. As a boy he had no interest in it. He wanted his books. He wanted to play. He believed the world could be understood through learning, and that understanding it was sufficient. The old man's jaw worked once. Then he read something. I never knew what. He put down the books and picked up a sword, and by the time he was a man, he was the finest fighter in the 7 kingdoms. A boy who became a weapon because he decided he had to be. His grip tightened slightly in his lap. I think that is also you. Jon said nothing to that either. How did you come to know these things? Aemon asked. Lyanna's words. The promise Ned swore. No living man knows those things except Howland Reed. I've lived a life that hasn't happened yet, Jon said. I know how that sounds. I am 101 years old, Aemon said. I have watched dragon skulls rot in the cellars beneath the Red Keep and Valyrian steel pulled living from the ice, and men walk back from beyond death. Say what you came to say. So Jon said it. Not all of it, there wasn't time for all of it, but the shape. The Red Wedding 3 weeks ahead. Robb alive and marching into it. His own death at a table in this very castle, in a life where he hadn't known enough, hadn't moved soon enough, hadn't understood until too late that knowledge was the only weapon that didn't run out of edge. Aemon listened without interrupting, his blind eyes fixed on something above Jon's shoulder, his breathing steady throughout. When Jon finished, the old man was quiet for a moment. The vow, Aemon said. Yes, it shall not end until my death. He recited it from the marrow, the whole weight of it, a man who had spoken those words himself and carried them for 80 years. You died. Whatever you are now, however you came back, you died. The watch of the man who died is ended, not looking for debate, closing a door that had already been decided. But that is the thin argument. You want the real one. The shield that guards the realms of men, Jon said. Yes, and something entered Aemon's voice for the first time that wasn't grief. Something older than grief. Something that had been waiting underneath it for a very long time. Yes, that is exactly right. He reached for his quill without fumbling, pulled a sheet of parchment toward him. He wrote in the dark with the hand of a man who had been writing in the dark for 30 years, each letter placed by memory and muscle, not by sight. Jon watched the words take shape, the Castle Black Maester's formal script, careful and clear, the wax seal pressed with a ring worn so smooth the stone had gone flat. The words across the top read, "On this day I release from his vows of service, by authority of his oath's own terms and his sworn duty to the realms of men." Aemon folded it, pressed it into Jon's hands and held them there. There is something else. His grip stronger than it had any right to be. Something Rhaegar wrote to me once, and only obliquely, the way he always wrote when something mattered too much to say plainly. He believed, he had convinced himself entirely, that the prince who was promised would have to lose everything before he could save anything, that the loss was not incidental to the work. His blind eyes found Jon's face with an accuracy that required no explanation. He was talking about himself. He was wrong. He was wrong about which one of them the prophecy meant, and he walked into a river and died for a misreading. His grip tightened once, then released. Do not be him. Rhaegar was brilliant, and he loved your mother, and he died for a thing written on old paper. You already know how dying ends. Choose something else this time. Jon held the folded letter against his chest and said nothing. There was nothing adequate. I prayed, Aemon said. His voice had gone very quiet, the words finding their way out with the specific care of things that had been kept a long time. I prayed every night for 50 years that the gods would grant me one more. Just one more chance to serve something worth serving before the dark. He turned his face toward the black slit of window, toward the wall showing pale and enormous beyond the glass. I never thought they'd send him to me here. At the end of the world. Jon stood there for a moment that he wouldn't be able to account for later. Then, he walked out. He didn't look back. If he looked back, he wouldn't leave, and he had to leave, and Aemon Targaryen, the last living person who had known what the family was before it burned, deserved the dignity of the dark and his prayers and whatever the gods were willing to send an old man in the last months he had. Ghost was in the corridor. He'd been waiting without sound. They went down together, 3 levels, out through the side door that opened onto the yard. The horse Sam had arranged stood at the post, tacked and ready, breath misting in the cold. A northern roan, not young, but sound, with the heavy-necked build of an animal that had spent years pulling the wall's supply carts and developed the patience of stone as a result. Jon checked the girth, checked the saddlebags, dried meat, whey bread, a skin of water, a second skin of something that smelled like Dornish red that Sam had clearly added on his own judgment, and which Jon was not going to question. Aemon's letter, folded small, went into the inner breast pocket of his cloak. He mounted. The wall stood above him in the last dark before dawn, 700 feet of it. A thing that shouldn't exist, built by men whose names no one remembered anymore against a threat most of the living world had spent 8,000 years convincing itself was children's talk. He'd climbed it once in a blizzard. He'd watched it come down in a life that was over now. He turned the horse's head south and put his heels in. Ghost ran beside him, silent and red-eyed and enormous, moving over the frozen ground without a sound. They passed through the gate. They crossed the cleared ground south of Castle Black. They entered the tree line, where the dark was complete and the cold had a texture to it, and the wall behind them shrank as it always did when you moved away from it. Slowly, then all at once. Until it was just a line of pale in the dark at the edge of vision. Then gone. He smelled the camp before he saw it. Wood smoke first, then horse and wet leather and the specific smell of several thousand men sleeping in the same field across enough consecutive nights that the ground beneath them had begun to surrender. Then food. Something boiling. Something roasted. The distant sweetness of something burned and not recovered from. It was the smell of an army that believed it was marching toward the end of a war, which was a different smell from an army that knew it was marching toward a fight. Armies marching toward fights smelled of oil and vinegar and sharpened steel. This one smelled of tired men counting the days until they were done. Jon came off the road a quarter-mile north of the first picket line and moved into the tree fringe on the western side. Ghost dropped back to his left shoulder without being asked, close enough that Jon could feel the body heat off him. At full dark, and at this distance, a man looking in their direction from the camp would see nothing. Ghost's eyes would register, if the man happened to be looking at exactly the right angle, as two dim red points at knee height, which would read as a fire reflection, or as nothing at all, because the alternative required believing something very large was standing in the dark, watching you, and most men found that conclusion too uncomfortable to reach. Jon watched the camp from the tree line for 20 minutes. The Dreadfort men were easy to find. Not because they were marked differently, Roose Bolton was too careful for that, but because of where they were. The positioning told it. 3 clusters of tents in the western quarter of the camp, arranged between the bulk of the northern lords' pavilions and the camp's 3 exit paths. Not protecting the perimeter, not anchored to any supply or command function, just occupying ground that would matter during specific minutes of chaos and not at all during anything else. Between those 3 clusters, a line of sight ran clean to the large tent in the camp center. Command tent, Robb's banner above it, the direwolf in gray on white, unstirring in the still air. Jon counted the Dreadfort men he could see. 60, perhaps 70. Half in partial armor despite the hour. He noted which ones were awake and which ones were performing the version of sleep that involved knowing exactly which direction the noise would come from. He'd already spoken to 2 men before entering the camp perimeter. A Mormont cousin named Dalt, who'd been assigned the western picket rotation and who had listened to what Jon told him with the particular northern quality of attention that involved no expression whatsoever, and then had said, simply, "How many do you need?" And Harwin, one of Ned Stark's household guard, who had survived everything up to this point through the application of careful competence and was currently assigned to the camp's interior watch. Both of them now knew their positions and the signal. Both of them were waiting. Jon moved. Roose Bolton's personal tent was set apart from his men by 40 feet on each side, which was either fastidiousness or a preference for having clear ground between himself and anything approaching. Jon had decided it was both. He came to the tent flap from the north side, where the shadow of the command tent's bulk fell across the ground, and stood outside it for a moment with his hand resting flat against the canvas. Through the canvas, lamplight, movement, scratching, quill on parchment. Writing at this hour. Jon pushed the flap back and stepped inside. Ghost came through behind him and stopped, filling the space between Jon and the tent's entrance, and settled into the absolute stillness that the wolf adopted when he had decided a room needed watching. Roose Bolton looked up from his desk. He did not startle. The quill paused mid-stroke, and his eyes came up, and that was the extent of the reaction, a very slight adjustment in focus, the way a man looks at a thing he did not expect and is already deciding what to do about it. His face was long and pale and composed, the eyes lighter than eyes had any right to be, almost colorless in the lamplight. He was in his riding clothes, not armor, the Bolton quartered sigil on his breast. On the desk beside the parchment, a bowl. In the bowl, dark and sluggish in the lamplight, the leeches he bled himself with regularly. 4 of them moving against the side of the bowl with the slow patience of things that had been alive longer than their shape suggested. His eyes moved to Ghost. Back to Jon. "Sit down," Roose said. His voice was exactly what Jon remembered, barely above a murmur, requiring the listener to lean slightly in, which was its own form of control. "Whoever you are, you've gone to a great deal of trouble. It seems poor hospitality to make you stand." Jon sat down in the chair across the desk. He did not rush what came next. Rushing was for men who needed momentum to carry them through their own uncertainty. "Your courier to the twins," Jon said. "The one you've been using as your relay since the campaign turned at Duskendale. His name is Merritt Frey." He watched Roose's face. Nothing moved. Merritt specifically, not a general Frey runner, because Merritt has a debt to you from before the war that he's been servicing with information and silence. Walder Frey doesn't know you use him independently. That's the point. The quill was still in Roose's hand. He hadn't put it down. "The arrangement you have with Tywin Lannister was confirmed at Barrington," Jon continued. "At a meeting that you conducted through an intermediary because the risk of personal communication was too high, and Tywin understood that. The intermediary was a septa who has been traveling with the army as a healer and whose loyalty is not to any sept." He put his hands flat on the desk between them. "The title promised to you in writing. In a letter currently held in Walder Frey's solar at the Twins, is Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North. Tywin's seal on it, his personal cipher at the bottom right corner, not the official hand seal, the personal one, because the official seal creates a chain of witnesses he didn't want. Roose set the quill down. He did it without haste. Set it in the groove at the desk's edge designed for it, aligned it, and folded his hands in his lap, and looked at Jon with those pale eyes across the lamplight and the bowl of leeches and the unfinished letter, and said nothing for a long time. "My son," Jon said, before Roose could reach whatever calculation he was building toward, is currently in the north. He sent 2 letters south to you in the past 6 weeks describing his activities at Winterfell and his plans for Theon Greyjoy. The second letter uses a word in the 3rd paragraph that you told him never to put in writing, and he did it anyway, because Ramsay Bolton does not follow instructions that inconvenience him, including his father's. You haven't replied to either letter yet, because you're waiting for the twins to resolve your situation before you deal with your sons. A long pause. "Who told you this?" Roose said. Not a question, a category. He was identifying what kind of problem had walked into his tent and deciding which of the available responses was appropriate for it. "You did," Jon said, "in another life." Roose studied him. The pale eyes moved across Jon's face with the careful impersonal attention of something reading terrain, not looking for guilt or fear or the tells of a man bluffing, but simply cataloging, filing what Jon was wearing, the condition of his boots, the wound stiffness in his right leg, the direwolf at his back. "You're a Night's Watch man," Roose said. "A boy. You rode from the Wall. I rode from the Wall. And you know things that exist only in private correspondence between myself and men who would not speak of it to anyone. Least of all a bastard," Jon said. "Yes, and yet." Another silence. The leeches moved in their bowl. "What do you want?" Roose said. "I want you to put your hands on the desk where I can see them and stay in that chair while I call 2 men in who are going to walk you to a place where you'll wait until Robb Stark has the time and information to deal with you properly." Jon held his eyes. "That's all. I'm not going to kill you tonight. I don't have the authority, and I don't have the time, and a body in a command tent creates problems I'm not willing to manage. But Lord Bolton, if you reach for anything on that desk that isn't the quill, Ghost stops being patient." Roose Bolton placed both hands on the desk. He did it the way he did everything, without performance, without visible emotion, with the quality of a man filing a thing under a category marked temporary. His eyes were still reading Jon's face, and they would probably keep reading it until there was nothing left to read. "You'll make a mistake," Roose said. "Conversational, informational, whatever you know and however you know it, you're one person doing this without institutional support. And that means variables you can't control. This will not go the way you've planned it. It already has," Jon said. He put his hand outside the tent flap. 2 knocks, evenly spaced. Harwin and Dalt came in. They were both bigger than Roose Bolton, and they both had their hands on their sword hilts, and they'd been told exactly what they were here to do, and neither of them looked like men who needed it explained twice. Roose stood without being asked to. He let his hands be taken. He walked to the tent entrance between the 2 men without a word, without resistance, without looking back, and was gone. Jon stayed at the desk. He looked at the unfinished letter. He didn't touch it. It was evidence, not his to disturb. He looked at the bowl of leeches, 4 of them still moving against the curved clay with their blind, patient circling. He stood. Told Ghost to stay. Walked to the command tent. The guard outside Robb Stark's tent was a young man with a spear. He was holding the way young men with spears held them when they'd been standing still for 2 hours, with technical correctness and genuine inattention. He saw Jon and the spear came up properly, and then his eyes moved to Ghost, who had followed regardless of being told otherwise. And the spear lowered by approximately 3 inches while the young man's brain reorganized. "Tell him Jon Snow is here," Jon said. "Tell him it's urgent, and it can't wait, and that he should come alone." The guard went inside. 40 seconds passed. The tent flap opened. Robb Stark stood in the entrance. He was 20 years old and wearing the robe. Stubble and trail dust and the particular look of a young king who had been carrying more than his share of everything for longer than he'd expected. He was taller than Jon remembered him being, or Jon was shorter, in this younger body, and the perspective had shifted accordingly. He looked at Jon. At Ghost. Back at Jon. His mouth opened and then closed. "Come with me," Jon said. "There's something you need to see." He walked back toward Roose Bolton's tent without waiting. Because if he waited, he'd have to explain before he was ready to explain, and the scene inside the tent was worth more than any explanation he could construct. He heard Robb's boots behind him, following without question, the way Robb had always followed when something in Jon's voice told him that questions would be answered in due time. He pushed the tent flap back. Roose Bolton sat in the chair against the tent's far wall, his wrists bound in front of him, Harwin standing to his right with one hand resting on his sword hilt, and the expression of a man carrying out an instruction he doesn't fully understand, but trusts completely. The lamp still burned on the desk, the leeches still moved in their bowl. Jon turned and looked at his brother's face. The confusion there was total, and underneath the confusion, something colder and more careful was already beginning to surface. The part of Robb Stark that was his father's son, that read a room without being told how, that understood before understanding was available. Jon held the tent flap open. "Come inside," he said, "and close that behind you. What I'm about to tell you, I need you to hear before anyone else does." They moved to the command tent because Jon asked them to, and because Robb, after one long look at the shape of what he'd just walked into in Bolton's quarters, understood that whatever was coming needed better walls around it than a captured man's canvas. The command tent was larger. A campaign table at its center with a map of the Riverlands weighted at its corners by a cup, an inkwell, a dagger, and a small weirwood carving of a wolf that Jon didn't remember from their childhood and which Robb must have acquired somewhere during the war. Grey Wind was in the corner, lying with his chin on his forepaws, his eyes pale gold in the lamplight, watching Jon from the moment he entered with the kind of patient assessment that wolves gave to things they hadn't categorized yet. Jon looked at him. Grey Wind looked back. Jon crossed to him and crouched and held out the back of his hand, and Grey Wind's nose came forward, and the wolf's nostrils worked twice, and then something in those gold eyes shifted. A subtle change in the quality of the attention, a recognition that had nothing to do with the present body or the present smell, and everything to do with whatever direwolves understood that the common tongue had no word for. Grey Wind licked his hand once, lay back down. Jon stood. Robb was watching him from across the table. Catelyn Tully stood at her son's right, and she had arrived with the composure of a woman who had learned to hold herself still in situations where falling apart was not available as an option, and who was currently working very hard at maintaining that composure in the presence of something she understood was about to cost her something. She looked at Jon with an expression that had not been simple in 16 years, and was not going to become simple tonight. "Jon," Robb said, his voice doing the thing voices did when they carried more than one question in a single word. They looked at each other across the campaign table. 3 years. The war between them measured in years now, not seasons. Robb had become something that Jon could see clearly required a reckoning, not the boy from the courtyard at Winterfell throwing the better form and the easy laughter. This one carried his dead with him in the specific way of men who've had to learn that the dead don't wait to be mourned when there's still a battle to manage. His face had the new lines around the eyes of a man who'd been making decisions that killed people for 18 months, and had learned to live with it without learning to be comfortable with it, which was the right way to manage it, and which had cost him, visibly. Jon thought, "I watched your crown roll across a stone floor. I watched a Frey soldier put his boot through it." He said, "Sit down. Both of you." Catelyn's chin came up a degree. She sat. Robb sat, and something about watching him sit, the young king settling into the camp chair with the unconscious authority of a man who'd learned to own the rooms he entered, made Jon's chest do something he didn't have time for. He locked it away, filed it in the same place as the leg wound and the 2-week-old exhaustion and everything else that needed addressing after this was finished. "What I'm going to tell you," Jon said, "I need you to hear without interrupting. If you interrupt, I'll lose the sequence of it. And the sequence matters, because the details are the proof." He looked at Robb. "When I'm done, you'll want to call me a liar. You won't be able to. Stay with me through it." Robb's jaw tightened once. He nodded. Jon told them the Red Wedding, not the way it lived inside him, which was noise and smoke, and the sound Grey Wind made in the kennels outside the twins when the arrows were already flying, a sound that Jon had carried since the moment Bran's vision gave it to him. A sound no living man with a working heart could hold without it costing something. Not that way. He gave them the logistics of it. The architecture. He described the interior of the twins' feast hall, the specific dimensions, the galleries above where the musicians sat, and which were also where 40 Frey archers would be positioned by the time the bread and salt were taken. The seating plan, Bolton men placed between the northern lords and the exits, dressed as ordinary guests. The signal, the moment the musicians changed to a specific song, the doors would close from the outside. He named the song. He watched Catelyn's face change when he named it. The Freys chose it deliberately, Jon said to her, because she needed to understand this. It wasn't incidental. They chose the Lannister anthem because they wanted the last thing the Northern Lords heard in this life to be a reminder of who had bought them. Catelyn's hands on the table edge. Both of them. Pressing down. Jon continued. He told them the specific bolt pattern, where Robb would be sitting, where the first volley would come from, the angle. He described Roose Bolton rising from his seat in the hall after the doors closed and the arrows had done their initial work. He told them what Roose said before the killing blow, and he said it without editorializing and without looking away from Robb's face. Robb's face had stopped doing things. It had gone to the place that faces went when they were receiving information that the body was refusing to process, because accepting it required a complete structural reorganization of everything the mind had been building its plans on for the last 6 months. It was not shock. Shock was an absence. This was a presence, every thought arriving at once, and none of them compatible with each other. Jon let the silence sit. "Grey Wind," Robb said. His voice had gone to something lower than his normal register, something that lived below the king, and was just the 20-year-old boy trying to hold the frame together. "What happened to... They killed him in the kennels," Jon said. "Outside the walls, before the feast began. They couldn't risk him being loose when it started." He paused. Then he gave him the rest of it, because Robb needed the full weight of it or he would spend the next week looking for the version where it was less than this. "They sewed his head onto your body, with your crown on it, and sent word of what was done to as many keeps as they could reach inside a fortnight." Robb's hands were very still on the table. "That's who they are," Jon said. "That's who you were riding to celebrate with." Nobody spoke. Catelyn made a sound that was not a word and was not a sob. It was the specific sound of a woman who had been carrying a dark instinct for months and been unable to name it, and had just had it named for her in the worst possible terms. She pressed one hand over her mouth. Her eyes were closed. "I told Robb," she said, into her own hand, barely audible. "I told him I didn't trust it. Something in the arrangement, the way Frey accepted too quickly after Edmure was offered. Something." Her hand came down. Her eyes opened, wet, and she looked at Jon with an expression he had never seen on her face in 16 years of being looked at by Catelyn Tully as something she wished had never been brought to her home. Something wrong about all of it. Jon held her gaze. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't open something else, and he needed her functioning, not unraveled. He looked at Robb. "I know you need proof. Not my word and not what I know. Something you can verify tonight." Robb's eyes came up from where they'd been fixed on the middle distance of a man watching a thing happen to him in his head. "Yes, a Frey man rode out of the twins 6 days ago heading for your camp. His name is Ryman Frey, Walder's heir. A man with both the authority and the appetite for this work. He's carrying a letter from Walder reconfirming the wedding arrangements, and he's bringing a cask of wine as a gesture of goodwill." Jon paused. The letter uses the phrase "old debts settled" in its second paragraph. It isn't a pleasantry. It's instruction to Roose Bolton, confirmation that everything is still in order. He arrives tomorrow before the second bell. Robb looked at him for a long time. "And if he doesn't," Jon said, "then I'm wrong about everything else, and you can send me back to the wall in chains." Robb stood. He moved around the end of the table to the tent entrance, pushed it open, and called for his steward. Jon heard him give the instruction in a voice he kept level by visible effort. Have scouts on every approach road, bring any Frey rider directly to him the moment they reach the outer picket, don't announce the arrival to the camp. The steward's acknowledgement. The tent flap falling back. Robb turned around. He stood at the entrance with the lamplight behind him and looked at Jon the way he'd looked at him after their first real sparring session when they were 12 years old. That specific expression of someone revising a category they'd thought was closed. "How?" Robb said. Not a challenge, a genuine question. A young man trying to locate himself in something he'd been told was impossible and couldn't find a reason to disbelieve. "I died," Jon said, in another version of this, "and I came back here." He said it plainly, the way he'd said everything tonight. "I know how that sounds." Robb said nothing for a moment. "Then, you have your mother's eyes." Jon went absolutely still. "I know that's not." Robb stopped. "Restarted," Father said it once. Just once, when he thought I couldn't hear him. He was looking at you across the yard and he said it quietly, more to himself than anything. "He has her eyes." And I always wondered who he meant. He held Jon's gaze across the campaign table. "I think I know now." The lamp between them burned. Grey Wind lifted his head from his forepaws and looked at Jon, then at Robb, and put it back down with the settled certainty of an animal that had been waiting for a room to reach a particular temperature, and had finally felt it arrive. "There's more," Jon said. "There's more that I need to tell you. About who I am, and about what this war can be if we handle what comes next correctly." He sat down. "But first we wait for the Frey rider. Because when he arrives with that letter and that wine and that phrase in the second paragraph, I need you to already have decided what you believe. Not because I've convinced you, because you verified it yourself." Robb sat back down. "Then we wait," he said. They waited. The letter was on the table. Ryman Frey had arrived before the second bell exactly as Jon said he would. He'd come with a single outrider and a cask of Arbor Red tied across his saddle, and he'd been brought to Robb's tent without announcement and without the usual courtesies afforded to guests bearing gifts, and he'd read the room correctly enough to keep his explanations brief. The letter he carried was in Walder Frey's hand, small, cramped, the ink pressed hard into the parchment the way old men wrote when their grip had weakened, but their need to demonstrate authority had not. The phrase "old debts settled" appeared in the second paragraph. Ryman Frey was in the camp cells beside Roose Bolton. The cask of Arbor Red was untouched on the corner of the campaign table, because nobody in this tent was drinking anything that had traveled from the twins. 8 men stood around the map. Robb at the table's head, with Grey Wind pressed against his left leg, and the expression of a man who'd spent the hours between midnight and dawn doing something to his grief that hadn't resolved it, but had compressed it into something he could work with. Catelyn to his right, composed and dry-eyed and harder around the eyes than she'd been yesterday. Lord Jason Mallister of Seaguard, whose son Patrick had campaigned with Robb since the beginning. Sir Brynden Tully, the Blackfish, who had said nothing when Robb explained the situation, and had then asked 3 questions so precise they removed any remaining doubt about his competence. The Greatjon, Umber's lord, who was the largest man in the tent by a significant margin, and who had been standing in the same position for 20 minutes with his arms crossed and the look of a man swallowing something that was fighting back on its way down. Lord Mallister's cousin, Sir Desmond. Harwin, who was present because Jon had asked for him and because Robb had learned overnight to extend that trust. And Jon himself, standing at the long side of the map with a stick of charcoal in his hand. Nobody had slept. Jon put the charcoal to the map and drew the twins. 2 squares representing the towers, one on each bank of the Green Fork, a rectangle between them for the covered bridge. He marked the feast hall inside the western tower, ground floor, connected to the courtyard by a single set of double doors on the south face and 2 servant entrances on the north. He marked the galleries above, each one with a small cross. He drew the exterior camps in their positions north and south of the towers, 3 of them. Each one where Frey cavalry would be quartered during the wedding celebrations. "The archers go here," he said, pointing to the gallery crosses. "They need approximately 30 to 40 minutes to position once the wedding party is inside and the feasting has begun. During that window, they'll be moving through the upper corridors of the western tower. They use the servants' stair on the tower's interior north wall. It's the only stair that reaches the gallery level without passing through the feast hall itself. How many archers? Brynden Tully asked. 40, give or take. Enough to put 2 bolts into every man at the high tables before anyone reaches a door. Jon drew a line across the gallery positions. The doors will be barred from the outside during the same window. Bolton's men seated at the floor level handle the secondary work after the volley. The Great Jon made a sound that was not quite a word. They were going to bar the doors from the outside, he said. His voice had a quality Jon recognized, not disbelief. The Great Jon was past disbelief, but the specific fury of a man who prided himself on facing his enemies in the open, and who had just learned how small that pride would have made him look in someone else's plan. Bar the bloody doors and shoot us like yes, Jon said. The Great Jon's jaw closed. He stood there breathing. So, Jon continued, the gallery stair is the fulcrum. Control it before the archers reach it, and the whole plan collapses. He marked the stair position on his drawing. We need 12 men inside the twins before the wedding party arrives. Not soldiers, servants, smiths, cooks, grooms, men who can move through the servants' quarters of a busy castle during a wedding without drawing attention. They go in 2 days before the feast, embedded with the actual kitchen staff being brought in from the outlying Frey holdings. Their job is one thing: be at the bottom of that stair when the archers try to use it. Hold it until the signal. What signal? Mallister asked. The music, Jon said. He let that sit for a moment. They planned to use a specific song as the signal to begin. The Lannister anthem, played by the Frey musicians when everything was positioned. When that song started, the doors were supposed to close. He looked around the table. Let it start. Let the Freys hear it, and believe everything is proceeding. The moment that song begins, our men at the stair take it. Our men in the hall take the doors. Open them, not close them. And the 3,000 men positioned outside the twins' perimeter come through every entrance simultaneously. Silence at the table. Brynden Tully was already looking at the exterior camps on the map, his eyes moving between them, calculating the Frey cavalry in the outer camps, he said. Replaced the night before, Jon said. The real Frey cavalry are disarmed and held in the woodline. Our men take their positions wearing Frey livery. By the time the feast begins, every armed man within half a mile of the twins is ours. Brynden looked up from the map with the expression of a man who had built ambushes himself and was now examining someone else's architecture with professional respect. Edmure Tully had been standing at the table's far end without speaking. He was younger than his uncle by 30 years and carrying it differently, not with Brynden's compressed competence, but with the visible effort of a man trying to locate the line between his fear and his obligation. He found it now. The wedding, he said. Jon looked at him. The wedding proceeds, Edmure said. Not a question, arriving at it from the inside. Rosalind Frey. The ceremony. He stopped. I still go through with it. Yes, Jon said. Edmure absorbed that. He nodded once, slowly, with the look of a man nailing a door shut from the inside. Right. His voice was even. Right. Yes, it has to look normal until it doesn't. He looked at Catelyn. Something passed between them. Some Tully family language Jon didn't have access to. She put one hand briefly on his arm. He straightened. Tell me what I need to do. Jon told him. Edmure listened, with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set, and did not interrupt. The Great Jon, who had been standing in the same position for 15 minutes, processing the same thought, finally uncrossed his arms. I want to be the one who goes to Walder Frey, he said. In the hall. When it ends. I want to be the one looking at him when he understands what's happened. You'll be outside the perimeter, Jon said. I'll be inside the hall. Great Jon, I will be inside the hall, the Great Jon said, in the voice he used when he'd finished discussing something, which was the same voice most men used for all other things. I won't touch him before you say. But I'm in that room when you take it. That's not something I'm asking. Jon looked at him. The size of the man, the complete absence in his expression of anything performative. He wasn't posturing. He was informing. "You'll be at the feast as one of Robb's honor guard," Jon said. "You'll carry nothing visible." "I won't need anything visible," the great Jon said. The matter was closed. They worked the details for another 2 hours. Who went in as servants? Which roads the outer cavalry would take to approach the Frey camps without being seen from the tower walls? The timing between the ceremony's end and the feast's beginning, the window when the hall would be reconfigured and the gallery archers would try to move. How to communicate the signal from inside the tower to the men in the exterior camps when the walls and distance made voices useless. Jon solved the last problem with 3 men on the covered bridge, each carrying a specific colored cloth, a relay system that required no sound and no interpretation. Catelyn drafted the specific wording of the confirmation raven back to Walder Frey. She sat at the campaign table's edge with a quill and composed in her own hand with the careful neutrality of a woman who had spent years navigating correspondence that said one thing and meant another. She read it aloud when she was done. Every word was correct. The warmth in it was precisely calibrated, enough to read as genuine, not enough to read as eager. Jon looked at her when she finished. "That's well done," he said. She looked at him. The complexity of 16 years between them, of a lie she didn't know was a lie, of a child she'd resented for something he'd had no control over. She didn't say anything. She returned to the letter and made one small adjustment at the end. Jon let it go and looked at Robb. Robb had been listening throughout without speaking. Not passive, present, absorbing, flagging the details that needed resolution, and watching Jon resolve them. He'd spoken 3 times, once to give Brynden his authority to commandeer horses from the cavalry trains, once to send Harwin for the specific measurements of Frey livery currently in their supply train, and once to tell the Grey Aeon, without room for debate, that he'd be inside the hall or he'd be explaining himself to his own keep, and that the choice was his. The Great Jon had grinned at that one. When the last detail had been settled and the other lords were filing out into the early morning, Robb stayed. He looked at the map, at the charcoal drawing of the twins that Jon had built across it, a trap for a trap. Each element reversed. "Grey Wind goes in with me," Robb said. Jon looked at the direwolf, still pressed against Robb's leg, the gold eyes open and quiet. Grey Wind at full size inside the feast hall of the twins, among men who planned violence, who carried hidden things, whose bodies understood what their faces were trying to hide. A direwolf that had been running beside armies for 18 months and knew the smell of intent the way Jon knew the feel of a sword hilt. "They won't like that," Jon said. "The phrase." "No," Robb said. "They won't." Grey Wind lifted his head from the floor and looked at Jon with an expression that was not readable in any conventional sense and was entirely readable in every other. Jon thought of a kennel outside the twins, a heavy door barred from the outside, a wolf screaming in the dark with nowhere to go. "Grey Wind goes in," Jon said. Robb nodded. He reached down and put his hand on the direwolf's broad head, and Grey Wind closed his eyes briefly and then opened them again, and the matter was settled without another word between them. The way the most permanent things usually were. The twins were smaller than the songs made them. That was the first thing Jon noticed riding in with the outer guard. Not the soldiers, not the servants, just the visible portion of the escort that a king brought to a wedding when he wanted to appear relaxed. The towers were stone and solid, and their position above the river gave them genuine tactical value, but they were not impressive. They were the stronghold of a man who had built his entire life on controlling one crossing, which meant the towers existed to intimidate people who needed to cross and had no other option, and were not designed to impress anyone who'd seen an actual castle. Walder Frey had spent 90 years making the most of that one advantage. Jon could respect the efficiency of it, in the abstract, the way you could respect the efficiency of a trap. The outer gate opened for them. The feast hall smelled of tallow candles and river damp, and the specific sweetness of rushes put down fresh that morning. Someone had scattered dried lavender in them, which was a southern touch that sat oddly against the twins' gray stone walls and the general atmosphere of a man who believed hospitality was a transaction. Long tables down both sides, Frey banners hanging from the rafters, musicians on the raised platform at the hall's western end, strings and pipes, playing something light and local that Jon didn't recognize. He looked at the galleries above without moving his head. Empty, or apparently empty. The columns supporting the upper level were wide enough to stand a man behind, and two of them showed shadows that the candlelight didn't fully account for. 3 hours from now, if the original plan had been running on schedule, those shadows would have been 40 archers with crossbows and a song for a signal. Currently they were 12 of Robb's men in servants' clothes who had been inside the twins for 2 days, and who knew exactly which shadows to occupy. Jon took his seat at the lower tables, unremarkable, another face among the northern escort. Ghost was not in the hall. Ghost was outside the walls, with the outer cavalry in the woodline. Which Jon had decided was correct, because Ghost inside would have read as threatening before the moment it needed to read as threatening, and the moment needed to be chosen rather than triggered. The Great Jon was 4 seats to Jon's left, wearing the expression of a man enduring a long process, with very limited patience and doing it correctly regardless. He had a cup of wine in front of him that he had not touched. At the high table, Robb sat in the place of honor beside Walder Frey. Grey Wind lay at Robb's feet. Every Frey within 15 feet of the direwolf was maintaining their proximity with the careful stillness of men who had made a decision to hold their position and were regretting it quietly. Walder Frey was 91 years old and looked like something that had been drying out slowly for several decades and had decided to continue regardless. His eyes were pale and sharp, and they moved constantly, over his guests, over the doors, over the hall's layout, over Robb's face, over the seat where Roose Bolton was supposed to be sitting. The seat was empty. Walder's eyes had gone to it 3 times already. Edmure Tully married Rosalind Frey before the feast. Rosalind was 20 and slight and genuinely pretty, and when the septon finished the words and Edmure looked at his new wife for the first time without the ceremony between them, Jon watched something move across her face that was not calculation and was not performance. She was afraid. Not of Edmure, of what she knew was supposed to happen tonight and which she'd had no power to prevent, and which, Jon understood now, was not going to happen. She didn't know that yet. Jon would have told her if there had been a way to tell her that didn't risk everything else. There wasn't. He held the knowledge of her fear through the ceremony and the beginning of the feast, and did nothing with it except keep it where it reminded him that the people inside this plan were not abstractions. The bread was brought. The salt. Robb ate. Catelyn, seated further along the high table, ate. The northern lords ate, one by one. The old ritual of hospitality enacted with the full weight of its meaning, the old gods watching through every weirwood in the world as guests became protected and hosts became bound. Walder Frey ate last. His jaw worked. His pale eyes were on the empty chair again. The music changed. Jon heard it 3 notes before anyone else at his table did. The strings shifting from the local melody into something slower, more formal, the specific descending pattern that every man in the 7 kingdoms with any connection to Lannister power knew on instinct. The Rains of Castamere. 4 strings beginning it softly, the way the musicians had probably been instructed to begin it, meant to be almost ambiguous at first. A thing you might mistake for coincidence until it was too late to reach for a weapon. Walder Frey's hand went to his wine cup. He raised it. His eyes finally left the empty chair and found Robb's face, and his mouth began arranging itself into a smile. Jon stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He stood, and the quality of his standing was enough, the directness of it. The complete absence of apology or hesitation that the nearest tables registered it before the sound did. He said, in a voice pitched to carry the hall's length, Lord Frey. Before this song finishes, there's something you need to hear. Walder Frey looked at him. The smile hadn't completed itself yet. My name is Jon Snow, Jon said. I am Ned Stark's son, and I rode from the wall 11 days ago, because I knew what you had planned for this evening. I knew the position of your archers. He pointed up at the galleries. I know they're not there. Because my men are. He turned and looked at the Frey soldiers seated at the lower tables, the ones who'd been placed closest to the doors. The ones whose job had been to bar them from the outside when the music started. Stark men in Frey livery were standing behind each of them, had been standing there for 20 minutes. I know every piece of this. Walder's cup was still raised. It stayed there. The doors, Jon said. They opened. Both sets simultaneously, south face and north, the covered bridge entrance, and the riverside entrance. Cold air came through all four, and with it the sound of 3,000 men taking positions in a courtyard that had been held by Frey guards 4 minutes ago and was not held by them anymore. The hall did not erupt. That was the thing Jon had counted on, and had still not been entirely certain of until this moment, that the Frey soldiers in the room, cut off from their archers and their barring teams and their cavalry outside, confronted with grey wind rising from the floor at Robb's feet to his full standing height, and the great Jon already on his feet, with his hands visible and ready, and the specific quality of readiness that suggested he was hoping someone would make a poor decision, would do the arithmetic correctly. They did. Weapons were not drawn. Jon walked to the high table. He placed on it a leather folio, recovered from Walder Frey's solar by 2 of Robb's men 2 evenings ago, carried south in Jon's saddlebag from Castle Black, unopened in his possession until this hour. He opened it. "This is a letter bearing the seal and personal cipher of Tywin Lannister, Hand of the King," Jon said. He read from it. Not the opening. The opening was pleasantries, the formal language of a man who knew how to write a document that could be read as innocent if found in the wrong hands. He read the 3rd paragraph, which was not pleasant and was not ambiguous, which named a title, a promise, and a date, and which referenced Walder Frey's cooperation in terms that left no interpretation available except the one that destroyed both men who had written and received it. He read it in full. Twice, the northern lords at the tables listened. Lord Mallister's face went through several things. Brynden Tully, seated at the Riverland's end of the high table, sat without expression, but his eyes were moving between the letter and Walder Frey and Bolton's empty seat, with the specific focus of a man indexing everything for future use. Edmure Tully, beside his new wife, had his hands flat on the table. Rosalind Frey's hands were in her lap, and she was looking at her father with an expression that was not surprise. Jon put the letter down. He looked at Walder Frey. Walder's cup was on the table now, his hand beside it, papery and still. His pale eyes on Jon without blinking, reading him the way old men who have survived by reading rooms read things, looking for the edge, the angle, the thing he could still use, finding nothing. "We accepted your bread and your salt," Jon said quietly. "Your gods and mine were watching. And you planned this anyway." He stepped back. This part was not his. Robb stood. Grey wind stood with him, and the direwolf's presence in the hall had a quality that the hall's stone walls couldn't contain. Something that moved through the room at a register below sound. Something that made the Frey soldiers near the doors take one collective half-step backward without deciding to. Robb looked at Walder Frey for a long moment, at the old man in his carved chair at the head of his own hall, his wine untouched, his plan dismantled around him with the cold efficiency of men who had known every piece of it before they rode through his gate. "You invited a king into your house," Robb said. His voice was level, carrying, the voice of a man who had learned what authority sounded like by spending 18 months exercising it in situations that punished mistakes. "You fed him bread and salt with the gods watching, and you sold him to his enemies for a title and a castle." He paused. "There is no law in any kingdom in the world that calls that anything except what it is." He named it. He named every charge, and he named every name, and he did it without theater and without anger, which was worse than anger because it had the weight of something that had already been decided in a room cleaner than this one. The Frey sons who had organized the gallery positions were taken from their seats one at a time, identified by Jon specifically. Walked out through the south doors by Stark soldiers who had been given their descriptions 3 days prior. Walder Frey remained in his chair throughout. When it was done, when the hall was reorganized and the Frey garrison was disarmed in the courtyard, and the covered bridge was held, and the riverside gate was held, and the outer cavalry camps were held, and every armed man within the twins' walls was a Stark man, or a man with his hands behind his back, Robb walked to the head of the table. He stood over Walder Frey. He didn't touch him. He didn't need to. Walder looked up at him. Something moved in the old man's eyes that Jon watched from 20 feet away, and could not name precisely, not fear, exactly, though fear was in it. The specific expression of a man who had built his entire life on the premise that everyone could be bought, had bought successfully for 9 decades, and was confronting for the first time the particular kind of man who genuinely could not be. "My lord," Robb said, with a courtesy that was its own blade, "I have no further use for this crossing." The sentence landed in the silence of the hall like something dropped from height. Walder Frey said nothing. Outside, the green fork moved under the bridge, with the sound of water that had been running between these two towers for 300 years, and would keep running after the towers were memory, indifferent to every transaction that had happened above it. The twins still smelled of last night's candles. Tallow and river damp, and the specific sweetness of lavender cut with something underneath it that was not a smell exactly, more a quality. The residue of 8 hours of held breath exhaled all at once when the doors came open and the cold air came in. It had followed them out through the gates into the morning. That quality. Mixing with frost and mud and the smoke from the field fires the army had kept burning through the night. Jon stood in the outer courtyard and watched the last of the Frey banners come down from the northern tower's rampart. The men working the ropes above were taking their time, not from slowness, but from the particular deliberateness of men performing an act they understood was significant. The Stark direwolf went up after, gray on white, catching nothing in the still air, hanging clean. Behind him, through the gates, the assembled host waited. Robb spoke first. He stood on the back of a supply cart that elevated him above the first rank of lords without requiring a platform, which was either pragmatism or the refusal of ceremony, and Jon suspected both. 3,000 men in loose formation on the riverbank mud, their breath misting in the grey cold. The lords pulled forward in a rough inner ring, Brynden Tully with his arms crossed, Mallister beside him, the Grey Adjon a head taller than anything near him, Edmure Tully still wearing the expression of a man recalibrating its speed. Catelyn stood to Robb's left, slightly behind. She had not spoken since the hall. She was watching the assembled lords with the quality of attention Jon recognized from 16 years ago. Catelyn Tully reading a room the way her father had raised her to read rooms, cataloging each face, assigning weights. Robb told them what had happened in the twins, and what the letters said, and what would have happened if the plan had run. He said it without editorializing. He said Roose Bolton's name and let the lords do what lords did when they heard a name they'd trusted, placed in a category they hadn't known it occupied. There were no sounds from the inner ring that Jon would have called reactions. There were adjustments, weight shifting, jaws working. Eyes moving between the twins' towers and each other, with the quick arithmetic of men figuring out what their recent proximity to a man like Roose Bolton had cost them. When Robb finished, the field held its silence for a moment. Then, Jon stepped down from the cart's side and walked forward. He had Aemon's letter in his breast pocket, against his ribs. And he had held it there through the neck, and through 14 days of hard riding, and through the twins' feast hall and through the night. He took it out now. Unfolded it. The parchment was worn at the crease lines from handling, but the writing held clear, Castle Black Maester's formal script, the seal broken, but intact in its wax below. "This letter was written by Maester Aemon," Jon said. His voice carried in the still morning air without effort. "Who is Aemon Targaryen? Son of Maekar I, great-uncle to Rhaegar Targaryen, and currently the oldest living member of a family that most of you believe is extinct. He let that establish itself. It releases me from my Night's Watch vows on the grounds that the vows' own terms have been satisfied. But that isn't why I'm showing it to you." He refolded it and held it in his left hand. "I'm showing it to you because a Targaryen wrote it. And a Targaryen recognized what was standing in front of him when I came to his chambers 11 days ago and told him the truth about who I am." The Great Jon said distinctly from the inner ring, "Say it plainly." Jon looked at him. "Rhaegar Targaryen was my father," he said. "Lyanna Stark was my mother. She died in a tower in Dorne giving birth to me. Ned Stark was the only man at her side who survived, and before she died she made him promise to protect me, from Robert Baratheon, from anyone who would put a knife in a Targaryen infant's throat and call it necessary." He looked across the assembled faces. "He kept that promise for 16 years. He is dead now, and cannot keep it himself, so I am keeping it for him." Silence, the green fork moving behind the twins. "My true name is Aegon," Jon said. Sixth of that name. Under the laws of Targaryen succession as Rhaegar's legitimate son, his marriage to Lyanna Stark was performed by a septon in Dorne, and its record sits in the citadel at Old Town, in the diary of High Septon Maynard, waiting for any maester to retrieve it. I am the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Joffrey Baratheon is not Robert's son. Robert's claim rested on conquest. Mine rests on blood. He stopped. Lord Mallister spoke from the inner ring. His voice was measured. The voice of a man who had survived Balon Greyjoy's first rebellion and 2 years of this one by never saying the first thing that came to him. "There is another Targaryen," he said, "across the narrow sea, with 3 dragons. What makes your claim stronger than hers?" "Succession," Jon said. "Rhaegar was the heir apparent. He died before Aerys. That makes his son the heir, not Aerys's daughter. Daenerys is my aunt. Her claim comes after mine, under every rule of succession the Targaryens ever practiced." He held Mallister's gaze. "And when she comes west, and she will come west, I have reason to believe that, though I can't explain how, we will need the realm unified and stable enough to meet 3 dragons with something other than a civil war already in progress." Mallister absorbed that, and said nothing else. "A man's sword arm makes him king," the great Jon said, and his voice was not hostile. It was the voice of a man working a problem aloud that he'd been working since the words Rhaegar Targaryen left Jon's mouth. "Blood and papers and Septon's diaries are well enough, but what holds it is the army behind the blood." "Yes," Jon said simply. The Greyatyon looked at him, then looked at Ghost, who had come through the outer gate at some point in the last few minutes, and was now sitting at the edge of the inner ring, red eyes open, 20 stone of direwolf perfectly still in the morning cold. "Aye," the Greyatyon said. Not agreement exactly, something more like the closing of a file he'd been keeping open. Movement at the woodline to the north, 3 riders emerging from the trees at a walk. The lead figure was small and slight in the saddle, dressed in dull green and brown that had absorbed the neck's darkness into its fabric. He rode without urgency, as though he had calculated the exact moment of arrival and had been targeting it for days. Howland Reed dismounted 20 feet from the inner ring. He was shorter than Jon in this body, wire-thin, with eyes the color of dark water and the particular stillness of a man whose home moved, and who had therefore learned to be the fixed point in every room. He looked at Jon for a long moment. "I received 3 ravens," Howland said. His voice was quiet enough that the lords in the inner ring leaned slightly inward. "The last one I understood. The first 2 I had to work at." His eyes moved across the assembled faces, cataloging with the same quality that Catelyn had, but where Catelyn catalogued political weight, Howland Reed catalogued something older and more fundamental. "I was at the Tower of Joy," he said, to the lords, without preamble. "I was one of 7 men who rode there with Eddard Stark. 5 of us died. Ned and I lived." He looked at Jon. "I held this man when he was an hour old. Lyanna named him before she died. I heard her say it. He let the pause sit exactly as long as it needed to. His name is Aegon." The inner ring went still in a way it hadn't gone still for any of the words before. Robb moved. He stepped down from the supply cart. He walked forward through the inner ring, and the lords parted for him. Not because they were directed to, but because the quality of his movement asked for space. The specific contained certainty of a young man who had made a decision in some private room of himself, and was now executing it in public without performance or hesitation. He stopped in front of Jon. He reached to his belt. The crown had been there since the twins, not on his head. Robb had not worn it in public since the hall, as though the night had clarified something about what it represented that he was still working through. He held it for a moment in both hands. It was hammered iron, plain and dark, the kind of crown a man wore because it needed to exist, rather than because it needed to impress, shaped by a northern smith from the materials at hand. Functional and unornamented, carrying its authority from the man beneath it rather than from any craft of its own. He set it in the mud at Jon's feet. He went to one knee. "Your Grace," Robb said, his voice carrying the field without strain. the voice of a king relinquishing a title he'd earned by blood and replacing it with one he was choosing. The North is yours. What it has, what it can field, what it can hold, yours, I ask only to serve it. Jon looked at his brother, at the crown and the mud between them, at the 20-year-old face turned up toward his, with an expression that was not diminishment, and not defeat, and not relief, the specific expression of a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had just handed it to someone with the right hands for it. Around the inner ring, one by one, the lords knelt. The great Jon last. He went down with the slowness of a very large man, making very sure of his footing, and when he was down, he looked up at Jon with those umber eyes and said, "Don't waste it." "I won't," Jon said. He reached down. He left the crown where it was. "Stand up," he said to Robb. "I need my Warden of the North on his feet." Casterly Rock did not look like something men had built. It looked like something men had found and hollowed out and lit from inside, a mass of pale stone above the sunset sea so large that the word castle failed it in every direction, a geological event that happened to have windows. The cliffs it sat on dropped 300 feet to the water. The water at their base was the particular gray-green of deep cold, moving with long, slow swells that came off the open sea and broke on the cliff face with a percussion Jon felt in his sternum at 2 miles distance. The morning fog sat at the rock's midpoint like something the rock had generated from its own mass, cutting the lower cliffs from the upper battlements so that from the sea it appeared to float. Lannister banners on the upper walls, gold lion on crimson, one on each visible tower, catching the wind off the sea with the ease of things that had hung there for 3 centuries and expected to hang there for 3 more. Jon lay on his stomach on a limestone shelf 40 feet above the waterline and looked at it through the fog and thought about a conversation he'd had with Tyrion Lannister in a version of this life that no longer existed. They'd been at a table in Dragonstone, in another life, in a war room above the sea, both of them studying maps with the particular tension of people who needed each other and hadn't fully decided to trust it yet. Tyrion had talked the way Tyrion always talked when he was drinking and working through a problem simultaneously, with the compulsive precision of a man who had organized the entirety of his interior life into information, because information was the only resource that couldn't be taken from you by a larger man. "The rock has a water gate," Tyrion had said, his mismatched eyes on the map rather than on Jon. "On the western face, below the main postern by about 60 feet. It was designed as an escape route. If the main gates were ever taken, the Lannister lord could go down through the lower chambers and exit at the waterline. My father sealed it. My grandfather sealed it before him. The Lannisters have been sealing that gate for 100 years because they know it's a weakness. And every time they seal it, they assign the guard detail to men who already know about it rather than men who don't, because the reasoning is, better men who know the secret than men who might ask questions about why that particular wall gets checked twice." He'd refilled his cup. "Except men who know secrets get comfortable with them. Eventually they stop checking." Jon had filed it away without knowing he was filing it away, without knowing that he would one day be lying on a wet limestone shelf in the Westerlands, counting the timing of watch rotations on a wall 300 feet above. 11 men behind him on the shelf. Not soldiers, they looked like fishermen, which they currently were, inasmuch as the 2 flat-bottomed boats pulled into the cave mouth below them had fishing nets piled in them and smelled authentically of their function. They were also the 11 best climbers Jon had been able to identify in the combined Northern and Riverlands host, selected on the basis of a single question asked of every captain: who in your company can go up a surface that other men call vertical? The men behind him had not asked what the surface was. That was also a criterion. Ghost was in the water. Jon didn't know how the wolf managed it without sound. A dire wolf in the sunset sea should have been audible, should have displaced enough water to register, should have been visible from the walls above. Ghost was none of those things. He surfaced once, 30 feet from the cliff face, directly below the Watergate position, his white coat flat against his skull so that he read as a pale shape in the gray swell, and nothing more, and then submerged again. Jon watched the walls. No reaction from the Lannister guards at the parapet's edge. "The gate is there," Jon said to the man beside him. Sir Gareth, a Lannister knight who had the build of someone who had been climbing since, before he could use a sword, and had never developed the opinion that this was unusual. Below the lip by 60 feet. Stone facing it from the outside, looks like a sealed arch. The mortar between the stones is 40 years old and hasn't been touched since. The mortar, Gareth said. We have 20 minutes before the western wall watch rotation. They do it on the bell, and the bell here comes off the main tower, which is on the rock's interior. Jon looked at him. Sound carries strangely off stone at this height. If we're quiet, the wind covers us. Gareth looked at the cliff. The way he looked at it was the way Jon had seen other men look at maps, identifying features, calculating sequences, assigning weights to problems, and setting them in order. We'll need the chisels at the mortar before we can get leverage on the stones, Gareth said. 15 minutes for the arch if the mortar's dry. More if it isn't. It will be dry, Jon said. The gate faces west. The wind off the sea dries everything on this face. Gareth said nothing else. He began moving. The arch opened on the 13th minute. The third stone came free from the facing, and the gate behind it, iron-banded oak 3 inches thick, was held by 2 rusted fixtures that had not been operated in 40 years, and surrendered the moment Jon put his shoulder against the left edge, and Gareth put his against the right. They came through one at a time, each man pulling up from the handhold below and rolling across the stone floor of a passage that smelled of seawater and old iron, and the specific still darkness of a room that had been holding its breath for 4 decades. Jon stood in the dark and listened. Footsteps, far above, the regular cadence of men on stone who'd been walking the same route for years and had stopped paying attention to what their feet were telling them. A sound from somewhere deeper in the passage that was water moving through a channel cut into the floor, a drainage system that kept the lower levels from flooding when the sea ran high. The smell of tallow from somewhere distant, carried by the passage's own air current, which told Jon there was a door with light behind it roughly 200 feet ahead. He put his hand out. Found Ghost's flank in the dark. The wolf's fur was cold from the sea and entirely dry, which was a thing Jon had stopped questioning. They moved. The garrison commander was in the lower hall. He was a Lannister cousin named Sir Daven, capable, steady, not a man who had been put here because he was expendable, but because he was reliable, which made him more dangerous than a frightened garrison would have been. He heard them coming with 2 guards at his back, and did not flinch, and did not shout, and assessed the 11 men materializing from the passage behind the armory wall with the rapid competence of a man who understood instantly that shouting was not his most useful option. Jon gave him the same thing he'd given Roose Bolton. Not a threat. An account. He told Daven how many men were outside. He told him where they were positioned. He told him how long it would take the Stark cavalry to reach the main gate from its current location in the valley below the rock once Jon opened it. He told him the casualty estimate if the garrison tried to hold, a garrison of 400 against 3,000, in a castle whose lower levels were already in opposing hands. Daven listened. His jaw worked once. "My Lord Tywin," he said. Not an argument. A statement of obligation, put in the air between them to be examined. "Is in King's Landing," Jon said. 3 days hard riding from here. By the time a raven reaches him, this is already done. He held Daven's eyes. "Your men are soldiers. This castle isn't a cause worth dying for tonight." Another silence. Daven gave the order. The gate mechanism was in a chamber off the main hall, enormous counterweights of iron, chains thicker than Jon's forearm, a wheel that required 4 men to move when it hadn't been turned in a fortnight, and was moved now by 2 of Jon's men who put their backs into it, with the focused application of people who understood exactly what was on the other side. The chains ran. The counterweights descended. Outside, the Casterly Rock main gate, 30 feet of iron-reinforced oak, the gate that had not been opened for an enemy in 300 years, began to move. Jon walked through it to meet Robb on the other side. The army came in at a walk, not a march, not a charge, a walk, because there was nothing left to charge at, and because the walk was its own statement. The specific unhurried pace of men entering a space they understood was now theirs, and were not in any particular hurry to demonstrate. 3,000 through the main gate, another 1,000 through the postern on the rock's eastern face that Gareth's men had opened from inside 20 minutes after the main gate. The Lannister lion came down from the towers in the way that things which have hung in one place too long come down, not cleanly, the cloth stiff with weather, the ropes reluctant until they weren't. The direwolf went up. Robb stood in the rock's inner yard and looked at the towers and the walls and the carved stone everywhere. Lions, lions, lions. 3 centuries of sculptural confidence in a family that had built its entire position on the premise that their seat was impregnable, and said nothing for a long moment. "The treasury," Jon said. "Yes," Robb said. "Show me." The Lannister treasury was on the rock's 4th level. Gold, not just coin but raw ingot, bars of it stacked in vaults that ran along the level's full interior length, the accumulated product of mines that went down 300 feet below them, and had been producing since before any Targaryen had sat an iron throne. It smelled of cold metal and old air, and the specific mineral density of a room that had been holding weight for a very long time. Robb stood in the entrance and looked at it. Jon watched his brother's face, not the gold, the face. Watched the young king do the arithmetic that the treasury demanded, what it meant to hold this, what it changed, how many armies it could field, and how many lords it could buy, and how many seasons of war it could sustain without ever touching the principal. "Tywin Lannister has one rule," Jon said. "He will not be outspent. He has never been outspent. Every campaign, every political arrangement, every alliance he's ever constructed has rested on the certainty that he has more than whoever he's dealing with." Jon looked at the vaulted ceiling of the treasury, at the lamplight moving off the stacked bars. "He doesn't have more than this anymore. We do." Robb was quiet for a moment. "He'll come," Robb said. "When the raven reaches him. He'll come with everything he has. He'll come with an army that hasn't been paid from this treasury in 3 weeks," Jon said. "And every lord between here and King's Landing will have heard what happened at the Twins and what happened here, and will be deciding whether Tywin Lannister's gold is still the safest place to put their loyalty." He paused. Men who fight for the winning side fight differently than men who are waiting to see if they picked correctly. Robb looked at him. "How long?" he said. Not asking for reassurance, asking for the calculation. "A week," Jon said. "Maybe less." Outside, through the thick stone of the treasury walls, faint and constant, the sunset sea pressed against the cliff face 300 feet below. The sound of water that had been here longer than the gold, and would be here longer than the men currently deciding what it was worth. Tywin Lannister's army began losing men at Ashford. Not to battle, to arithmetic. The first to go were the freerider companies, 600 mounted men who had contracted for a season's campaign, and whose contracts did not specify what to do when their employer's treasury was in opposing hands, and the news coming up the King's Road from the Westerlands arrived faster than the ravens could be recalled. They left quietly, in the night, which was the way men left things they didn't want to explain. Then 2 Lannister bannermen, Lord Liddon and Sir Harris Swift, whose combined strength was 800 and whose combined reasoning, delivered in a letter to Tywin's camp by a courier who left before a response could be written, was that their oaths were to House Lannister in prosperity, and they did not consider the current situation to qualify. Then, the Tyrells. The Tyrell withdrawal arrived in writing, a formal letter delivered to Tywin's command tent by a Tyrell maester traveling under neutral colors, carrying Lord Mace Tyrell's seal and the measured language of a man who had decided an alliance was finished, and had chosen the careful dignity of written notice over the risk of a face-to-face meeting with Tywin Lannister. The letter cited Highgarden's historic neutrality. It cited the Tyrell family's independent obligations to the Reach. It did not cite the 3,000 Stark and Riverlands cavalry now controlling the Gold Road behind them, but Tywin understood what was being cited. Tywin read the letter twice, set it on his desk, said nothing. The Tyrell host was gone before dawn. What remained of Tywin Lannister's army when it reached the King's Landing approaches was 12,000, still formidable, still professionally organized, still commanded by the most capable military mind in the Seven Kingdoms. 12,000 was enough to hold King's Landing if the city held with it. The city did not hold with it. 3 of the 7 gates opened without siege. Not because the city watch was loyal to the arriving force, The gold cloaks changed their loyalty the way market prices changed, in the direction of whoever held the scale. They opened because Tyrion Lannister had been inside King's Landing for 6 weeks, moving through its warrens with the specific knowledge of a man who had administered the city's infrastructure and understood which functionaries controlled which gates and what those functionaries needed in order to make a decision. Jon had sent Tyrion a letter from Casterly Rock. He had not asked Robb's permission. He had written it himself, sealed it with nothing because he had no seal that meant anything yet, and sent it with a rider who was paid enough to be reliable and told enough to be motivated. The letter said 3 things: that Jon had taken the rock, that Tywin's army was fracturing, and that the city did not need to burn. It asked Tyrion to open what he could. It did not ask him to betray his father. Tyrion opened 3 gates. The arrangement between what that cost him and what he received for it was not something Jon put into words when they met afterward, in the courtyard of the Red Keep, Tyrion looking up at him with those mismatched eyes, doing the calculation they were always doing. Jon simply held the man's gaze for a moment and nodded once, and Tyrion nodded once in return, and the accounting was closed. Tywin Lannister was taken in the Tower of the Hand. He had not fled. That was the thing, 12,000 men dissolving around him, the city gates opening, the Red Keep's outer yard filling with Northern and Riverland soldiers. And Tywin Lannister had gone to his offices in the Tower of the Hand and sat at his desk and continued working. When Jon's men came through the door, he was reading grain reports from the Reach. He set them down without haste and looked at the men in front of him with the expression of a man completing a sentence in his head before addressing an interruption. He looked at Jon, who came through the door behind them. He looked at him for a long time. "You're Rhaegar's," Tywin said. Flat, conclusive, the voice of a man identifying a thing he should have identified earlier and filing the error for review. "Yes," Jon said. Tywin absorbed that. His jaw did not work. His hands stayed on the desk. "What happens now?" he said, and it was not quite a question, it was a category, the same one he'd been interrogating since the moment the Rock's Raven reached him. What class of problem was this? What leverage remained available? "Justice," Jon said, "for Elia Martell, for her children, for every village the mountain burned on your orders during this war." He held Tywin's eyes and did not look away and did not perform it. Not revenge, justice, in front of witnesses, on the record, with every lord who needs to understand what the difference between power and authority looks like given the opportunity to watch. Tywin Lannister looked at him for another moment. "You'll make a capable king," he said. The sentence cost him something, and he paid it with the complete composure of a man for whom the cost of anything was simply another entry in the ledger. "I know," Jon said. He went in alone. Robb was in the yard with Grey Wind, managing the garrison's formal surrender. The lords were at the city gates and the harbor and the 3 captured towers, doing the 100 specific things that occupying a capital required when you intended to hold it rather than empty it. No one was told to leave Jon alone in the throne room. It simply happened, the way the most significant things simply happened, because something in the air around him communicated that this was not a moment that needed witnesses. The room was enormous and cold and dim. High windows on both sides throwing gray winter light across the floor in long strips that didn't reach each other. The brackets where dragon skulls had hung on the walls, removed to the cellars by Robert Baratheon 20 years ago and never returned, the fitting holes still visible as ghost shapes in the stone where the iron had been. The smell of the room was cold ash and old stone, and something beneath those things that might have been imagination. The Iron Throne sat at the far end on its dais. Jon walked toward it. He had seen it in another life. Had stood in this room after Daenerys had burned half the city to take it, and he had stood here trying to understand what that meant, and had not understood in time to prevent what came after. He had looked at the throne then and felt nothing that he could name. He looked at it now and felt the weight of everyone who wasn't here to see it. Ned Stark, who had sat on this throne reluctantly, briefly, as regent, and who had died because his honor would not allow him to do what surviving this city required. Robb's men who had died in a war that never needed to be fought the way it was fought. The small folk in the villages between Casterly Rock and the King's Road who had burned for Tywin's strategic communication program. Ygritte, in a version of events that this timeline had not yet reached, and which he intended, with every decision he could make in the years ahead, to prevent. The throne was ugly. That was the thing the songs never said. They called it magnificent and terrible and ominous, and a dozen other words that made it sound like something designed. It was not designed. It was accumulated. 1,000 swords melted by dragonfire and pressed together by Aegon the Conqueror's dragon over 3 days, not shaped so much as resolved, the way things resolved when heat was applied to enough separate elements simultaneously. The swords had kept their edges. You could see them in the mass, some pointing inward, some outward. Some horizontal in the iron body of the thing, in ways that made sitting anywhere except the exact center a careful exercise. Jon put his right hand on the nearest blade. The edge was old, but not dull. Cold iron held its edge differently than steel, longer and less perfectly. He pressed his palm flat against it, felt the edge's resistance, and then its acceptance, and then the thin line of warmth that followed. He looked at his hand. The cut was shallow, already closing. He sat down. The iron was cold through his clothing. The seat's angle required a specific posture, forward and upright, not relaxed, a position that made extended comfort impossible. Jon thought that might have been intentional. A throne that did not permit its occupant to be comfortable was a throne that kept reminding them of what sitting there meant. He sat and looked at the empty room and thought about the north, about the wall and what was beyond it, about an army that walked through cold and did not stop and did not bargain and could not be bought or reasoned with or turned by politics, about a Night King who had looked at Jon across the water at Hardhome with the specific quality of recognition, not of Jon as an individual, but of Jon as a thing that had stood between the dead and the living before, and would stand there again. The dead did not care who sat the Iron Throne. The dead were coming, regardless. And the only thing that had ever stopped them, the only thing in 8,000 years, was a realm that held together long enough to hold the line. United, supplied, committed to something larger than its own internal warfare. He heard boots at the throne room's far end. Robb came in from the south entrance, gray wind at his heel, and walked the length of the room without hurry. He stopped at the base of the dais and looked up at Jon with the gray Stark eyes they'd shared from different mothers, and the expression of a man who had been outside, doing the work that needed doing, and had come inside because something else needed doing now. "It's done," Robb said. "The garrison is stood down. The gates are held. Tywin Lannister is in the cells below the Tower of the Hand." He paused. "Joffrey is in the sept with his mother." Jon looked at him. "He tried to order the gold cloaks to hold the mud gate," Robb said. They looked at him and looked at what was on the other side of the gate and opened it. Something moved in Robb's face that was not quite amusement. "He's 13. He cried. He'll face judgment with his mother," Jon said. "Openly, whatever they are, we do it in front of witnesses." "Agreed." Robb looked at the throne, at the room, at the brackets on the walls where the dragon skulls had been. Then, at Jon. "What happens now?" Jon looked at his cut palm, already closed, the line thin and dark against the skin. "Now I send for Howland Reed," he said. "I bring him here, and I put his testimony on the record in front of every lord remaining in this city. The claim stands on its own, but it stands better when the last living witness to the Tower of Joy has said what he knows in a formal court." He looked at Robb. "Then I call a council, every lord who came south with us, and every lord who didn't, who needs to understand why sending representatives is preferable to waiting to see how this resolves." He paused. "Then I write a letter north to the wall, to the brothers remaining there, and to whoever Mormont left in command. I tell them what's coming. I tell them what I need from them and what I'll give them in return." "The White Walkers," Robb said. Not skepticism, not fear, the voice of a man who had decided to believe something difficult because the person telling him had been right about everything else, and because the alternative was to be wrong at a cost he could not afford. "The White Walkers," Jon said. "Everything we did from the moment I woke at Castle Black was to get here, not for the throne, not for the title, to get to a position where when I tell the realm what is coming from the north, the realm is unified enough to hear it. Fractured kingdoms don't survive what I've seen." He held Robb's gaze. "We aren't playing the game anymore. We're ending it. Every piece of it, the betrayals, the alliances of convenience, the lords moving their strength for personal advantage. All of it ends now, because we don't have the years to waste on it. Robb was quiet. You've seen it, Robb said. The long night. You've actually seen it. I've fought in it, Jon said. I've watched it take everything. His voice stayed level. I won't watch it again. The throne room held them in its cold silence. Outside, the sounds of a captured city reorganizing itself around a new authority. Boots on stone, orders called. The distant sound of the harbor and the Blackwater moving where they'd always moved, indifferent to what sat on what chair, on what days inside these walls. Ghost came in from somewhere. Jon hadn't heard him enter. The direwolf crossed the floor without sound and lay down at the base of the dais, his chin on his forepaws, his red eyes open and aimed at the throne room's south entrance, watching the door. As he always had. As he always would. Jon looked at Robb one more time. At his brother, the word was the right word, had always been the right word regardless of what the blood said. Standing at the base of the only throne in the world, and looking up at him with the expression of a man who had bent the knee once and meant it permanently, and was now doing what Starks had always done. Ready to work. Go home, Jon said. Go back to Winterfell. Hold the north. Prepare it. I'll tell you what I need from you and when. And Robb. He paused. Take Howland Reed north when the testimony is done. There are things he'll want to see. Things in the north that will matter soon. Robb held his gaze. Nodded once. He turned and walked back down the length of the room, Greywind rising and following without being called, their footsteps and their silence filling the space equally until the south door closed behind them. Jon sat alone on the Iron Throne in the cold light and thought about everything north of the wall, and the years he had, and what he would do with them. Outside, winter pressed against the city's walls with the patience of something that had been waiting a very long time and had learned not to be in any hurry. It would come anyway. He would be ready. Let us know what you'd like to see next.